let me just bounce this theory that pet theory of mine that I've had for some time in terms of like explaining the development of this, and I wonder if any of your research or just your thoughts just in general, that on the right there is, aside from the structure that they have built, just broadly speaking, there's a lot more money available for this type of stuff. I mean, Rush Limbaugh and all of right-wing talk radio on some level is subsidized by ideological money. I mean, maybe we can, whether it's the Heritage Foundation or through Hillsdale College or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And broadly speaking, I think we see that on the right online as well. Is there a difference in the incentive structure of just the audiences and the producers? Is it, on the left, it seems to me much of the material of the center left is, generated from academia, where the incentive structure, where the reward system is slightly different than on the right. On the right, it seems to be, how effective can you be at entering certain things into the society's media bloodstream? On the right, and on the left, it is how sound is your reporting, or how sound, does it withstand scrutiny? And that those fundamental differences in the way that one as a producer gets compensated just by, peer respect versus actual dollars adds to this dynamic that's already existing.
So I think it's important to separate two very distinct phenomena. For me, based on our research, the major transition point on the belief structure on the right had to do with the fact that Rush Limbaugh found a new business model, because big money supported right-wing publications from right after World War II on. Essentially, if you look at the National Review, Nicole Hemmer has a beautiful book called Messengers of the Right that looks at that first generation of post-war right-wing media. And what she shows there is that they essentially never became a business model. They sold some, they had relatively low circulation, and they relied partly on reader or listener contributions and partly on contributions from rich benefactors, exactly the model that you're describing. What was new about Rush Limbaugh, what was new about Fox News, is that they no longer depended on that kind of politically mobilized money, but instead actually found a business model that drew audiences that were loyal enough and large enough to actually make it big advertising business. So there, on the media side, I'm not persuaded by the story that it's about big money paying for them to do it, rather than just that they were able, because of all the reasons I described, to turn right-wing mobilized media from a partisan, narrow, and big money-funded enterprise into mass media, big business, and now online, clickbait, and online advertising business. What is, I think, correct about what you say is the flow of, shall we call it, higher status or research, not status so much as research type work, where essentially from right after the war with the World War II, with the Heritage Foundation, with the Foundation for Economic Freedom, and going through Cato and but particularly Heritage, the American Enterprise Institute, you saw a strategy on the right of creating a whole set of research organizations whose role was to produce right-wing viewpoint confirmation through throughout the story. Now, some of them are very politically mobilized and specific, like Judicial Watch, or like the Mercer-funded, Bannon co-founded Government Accountability Initiative. And some of them are much more serious think tanky type things. Those really do operate in a way that's very different from academia. And again, there's this imbalance where when you're inside a framework that depends on politically aligned donors, and you don't have the institutional constraints of academia, you certainly do see much more motivated research. It's not that you don't see academically mobilized research in the academia as well, in the university as well, but here you get institutional constraints that, at least for the more serious research, impose a much more serious constraint. So on that level of high quality, data-informed narratives that come into the media, I think your dynamic of money making a difference is important. On the media culture itself, I really do think it was a transformation of the business model to allow for advertising-based, hate-stoking, outrage industry to emerge.
One of the things that I feel like that technology has changed in some way. I mean, and I'm looking back at 2004. There was a meme in 2004 which was Drudge rules their world, and that was to articulate the efficacy of the sort of the way that the right wing narratives sort of entered into the society's bloodstream in some way. That it would go from Fox News or some of these sort of like quasi think tank institutions through Drudge, and then every producer at ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, at CNN would read Drudge, and Drudge would basically provide them their editorial decisions of the day. And to some degree, it seems like that social media in particular, but even starting with the blogs, started to push back on that in some way. And the dynamic changed to where it was almost if there was a realization amongst the right that, like, we don't even need to have the ABCs, CBSs, and NBCs buy this story anymore. Largely, we can just sort of maintain this narrative in our own bubble. We don't even need it to be validated anymore by the broader society. And yet, we still saw an example of, like, Steve Bannon going out and laundering Clinton cash through the organization that you just cited. Can you tell me about that dynamic, about how, on one hand, the right seems to be now sort of self-sufficient in terms of the narrative, and in other instances, we still have this sort of like mainstreaming of what essentially function as right-wing conspiracies?
So this is actually a really important point. But before I even start that, you mentioned Drudge. Drudge is still critically important. If you look at similar web traffic at one of the web traffic analysis firms, it looks like something like half of Alex Jones's InfoWars traffic comes from links from Drudge. Much more important than Facebook or Twitter or any other source for InfoWars. So Drudge is still important within that ecosystem in a really quirky way. But you asked, I think, a more important question, which is the role of mainstream traditional media in disseminating the crazy on the right. And I think it's our book. We have a chapter dedicated to failures of mainstream media. We have a chapter specifically around the ways in which, as you described, Breitbart and Bannon used the New York Times. The thing that's important to remember is that even though we don't know exactly how many people live fully inside the feedback loop, that's not the entire Republican electorate. So if you look, for example, at surveys and the question of, is the press the enemy of the people? It's shocking that 51% of Republicans in August of 2018 tell the Quinnipiac poll that they think that the press is the enemy of the people. But at the same time, that's only half. It's shocking that 48% of Trump voters tell a YouGov poll in December of 2016 that they think that emails showed that someone was running a pedophilia ring out of Clinton's campaign. But it's 48%. There's that roughly half-ish of Republican voters, could be as much as 25% of that of the population generally, could be as little as 15. We're not quite sure whether a quarter or a third of the population lives squarely inside the Fox News Breitbart universe, but it's certainly not all Republican voters. And this is the critical role that mainstream media played in taking those stories and generalizing to the public, because that's where the people who spend some of their time on Fox News, but much of their time on ABC, CBS, NBC, those are the people who really got confounded by mainstream media. So the story that you note, the story of Clinton Cash, was just a brilliant piece of information operation from Bannon. Literally 2 years before the election, it was clear that he already knew that the primary contenders would be Clinton and Bush and Jeb Bush. And he had the Government Accountability Initiative wrote a couple of books. One was called Clinton Cash, the other was called Bush Bucks. And they were both basically concocted conspiracies about how horrible, terrible, no good each one of these two families were in terms of selling the store of American politics for donors. In the case of Clinton, it was primarily Clinton Foundation. The trick with the Clinton Foundation was to then come and give the New York Times an exclusive 18 months before the election. An exclusive. So the Times went, they read the book, they followed up, and they came out with a big story. And the story had the blaring headline, "Cash flows to Clinton Foundation amid transfer of uranium to Russian firms." Sounds terrible. Somewhere in paragraph 15 or 17, there's buried, there was no evidence of wrongdoing, but still it raises issues. That story became the third most linked to story in the entire campaign story. A story from April of 2015 became the third most linked to story of all the Times stories throughout the entire election period.
Wow.
Because it was used by the right to reinforce and confirm and get a sense of validation for this story. So again, we document over and over again how the right-wing outlets are essentially teasing and putting things into the stream of mainstream media. The email releases had the same effect, and it's the inability of editors to keep the headlines consistent with the facts and the wish to sort of draw people in that ends up amplifying and validating these conspiracy stories that come from the right.
So what is, if you have it, what is the solution to this? Or what is there anything out there that can mitigate this dynamic? I mean, how do you pierce a bubble like that? So
first of all, we start ruefully the chapter on solutions with, if our diagnoses had been simpler and more technical, we would have been able to give you better technocratic solutions. These are deep structural problems of political culture and media culture. There are no easy solutions. I would say that the single most important thing that can happen, and we don't have this in the book yet because the data stopped at the beginning of 2018, but impressionistically, it seems like this is getting through to editors and newsrooms. The most important thing is that traditional professional journalists and editors need to understand that they are in a deeply asymmetric propaganda system, and that when they are propagating the stories from the right, they are essentially complicit. So the old model of plain objectivity in traditional media was to be neutral. Side says this, says that, side that said the other thing, and I'm just telling you what both sides says. When you have such dramatic asymmetry, to be objective by being neutral systematically makes you someone who validates falsehood from the right. And so you need to change the culture. And you're seeing already media willing to call out lies from the president, in particular from Trump, in a way that would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. Also, we have levels of lying that would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. So that's obviously pushing it. But so you need a change in professional media culture. That's the most important thing. Ultimately, it will require sustained losses by the Republicans so that they realize that it's a losing strategy and begin to walk things back on their own. But that's obviously out of the hands of anybody trying to create solutions. There are discrete things we can do. I think there's no doubt that we need immediate, substantial reform to introduce transparency into political advertising. The one thing we don't know is how effective the Facebook targeted advertising was for the Trump campaign in particular, and in particular how much dark ads, essentially ads that only very, very narrow sets of people see. So there are proposals like the Honest Ads Act that are on the table. Those won't solve the whole problem, but they're an important basic infrastructure for us to know what's going on. We need some accountability for the platforms, greater transparency to what's going on. And there's some initiatives primarily in Europe now around creating those. I doubt that those will come out in the U.S. soon. So we need to focus on the platforms because within 5, 10, 15 years, they will be the dominant source. But because so much of what's central now is happening still on cable TV and on radio, it's very hard to come up with solutions that are consistent with the First Amendment, other than this main shift in the practices of journalists and editors.
I'll tell you what scares me is that I think that the changes that we've seen in those journalists has been a function of Trump. But when we see, like, just for this, this weekend where we see things like Rick Scott saying, starting to talk about fraud in Florida, and in fact, this is getting repeated, and they're allowing Republican politicians and others to repeat this, even though Rick Scott himself has not called the police. He's the governor. He has the ability to investigate these things. I get a little worried that Trump allows the media to sort of say, like, hey, look, we're doing that. We're being skeptical, but then just sort of like leave it to just as if it was a Trump phenomena rather than the entire structure of a machine that brought Trump really to where he was, right? Like, the machine preceded Trump, right? I mean, that's you had to have a machine
absolutely
that was telling both its producers and its consumers, hey, Barack Obama may not be an American, for Trump to sort of ride that wave into office in some way.
I think that's exactly right. I think although Trump is both a symptom of a much longer outrage industry and a catalyst. You can't ignore, and we show it in the data, particularly in the chapter on immigration. He has this call and response relationship with right-wing media ecosystem, as well as with the mainstream media. And he is a real catalyst. He's not the source of the problem. He is definitely a symptom of years of the propaganda feedback loop on the right operating as we describe it. But he has certainly learned how to not only be a consequence, but be a real catalyst. And you can't ignore the fact that he's made things much worse, and he's essentially made it into the official policy of the United States to call the media the enemy of the people. But I agree with you that he makes it too easy, that in some sense professional journalists have not quite focused on how pervasive this phenomenon is in the Republican Party. And look, the more Trump succeeds with it, the more politicians on the right will follow him. People follow success. It'll have to show itself as a failure. And even the debate over whether or not the midterm was a blue wave or not is precisely a debate on whether the Trump strategy was a success or a failure. And I think the sense that somehow, the sense that emerged in the first day and that slowly we're learning was false, that there was no blue wave, has allowed him to continue to project this persona of a success. And as long as he's a success, people on the right will try to follow and copy him.
I appreciate your hanging with me for so long. A couple more questions. I just found this really fascinating. How do we know, how do we know the power of cable news and of these narratives in terms of I think it's easier to understand how they impact our politics in terms of almost legislatively, because many of the politicians themselves, they're bathed in this. But when we talk about cable news, for instance, we're talking about, I don't know, a whole universe of 5 or 10 million people maybe who watch all this stuff. And shows like this one, there's not, but how do we know that actually that it makes a difference? When we rail on somebody for trafficking in some type of conspiracy, how do we know from the data that this makes any type of difference, or how does that manifest itself?
So there are two ways. One is not stuff that we do. We just survey it from others, and that's survey. So Pew goes out and asks voters, what is your primary source of news, or what news source do you most trust? And there you get very clearly that when Pew, right after the election, asked Trump voters, what is your most important news source, 40% said Fox. Only about 7% said Facebook. So you know that Fox is much more important. On the left, just as we found with our own data, in the same survey, you see a much longer and smoother distribution of attention with other sites. Similarly, in our own data, if you look at attention, so take the Seth Rich conspiracy that DNC staffer leaked the DNC memos rather than that the Russians hacked it. Right after Seth Rich was murdered in Washington, D.C. as part of a robbery, there was a bubbling on the net of various fringe sites, maybe Russian-inspired sites, that was trying to say, no, it was Seth Rich, it wasn't anybody else. There was a moment where it spiked a little bit around WikiLeaks releasing a prize for whoever killed, and therefore implying that, in fact, he was the source. When you plot the amount of attention it got overall online during that early period when the more online extreme and WikiLeaks only propagation happened, to a period on the week in which Comey was fired, when Hannity and Fox and Friends and Fox DC even propagated the same conspiracy theory, that later time dwarfs several times over the amount of coverage and attention online there was to the fringe. And we see this again with the Uranium One story that was part of what we talked about with regard to the Bannon Breitbart. That happened the same thing. It was big, but it was overwhelmed in November of 2017 when things were going badly in the Mueller investigation for Trump, when suddenly Fox News, morning, noon, and night for a month, took on this Uranium One story, completely recoded it as a story about how Mueller and Rod Rosenstein and Andrew McCabe had helped Obama give the Russians 20% of American nuclear capabilities. I kid you not. It's that crazy.
No. I know that story well.
Explodes.
It's sad to say.
So when you look at our measures of attention online, it's very clear that when it makes it in a big way to Fox, it dominates what happens when it stays only online.
Yeah.
So that gives us a real level of confidence when you combine both the surveys of what people say they care about and the measures of what they search, Google Trends or whatever it is that we're using, that cable is really driving these beliefs.
I mean, I would imagine. I mean, certainly we saw that with the caravan too, and I would imagine that there is, and I'm sure it's been done in the past, and maybe we'll see it with this. There will be data that associates. Fox will explain why there were sort of disparate types of people reacting to one message or another in the context of these midterms. All right. So lastly, let me just ask you this, because when I talked about what can be done, much of it relied on the producers to responsibly, assess, what they were going after. And like I say, with the caravan, we saw that completely break down, right? Like nobody's covering the caravan anymore because there really is not a terribly relevant story to the American public about it.
There never was.
There never was. I mean, to the extent that there was any, it was just like, these guys are saying the caravan's important. We're not going to go down to the caravan because the caravan in itself is not important. We're just covering how these guys are saying, a ghost is important. And they weren't even able to provide that type of restraint. So aside from relying on the producers, what can the consumer or let's say citizens can do? Is there anything that they can do, or is it just like, let's hope for better editors?
So it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. In a universe where you think that everybody is confused and doesn't know what the truth is, you say, teach yourself, read a more diverse diet and all of that. In a universe that's consistent with our results, people don't not know. They know what they're getting. There are people who consume conspiracy theories are not, or particularly not so much conspiracy theories at the extreme, but just the mainstream Fox News-driven outrage. The people who consume that enjoy it. It's entertainment. It makes you feel good about yourself. To come to somebody and say, no, the thing you believe. Remember, in a Pew report, when you ask consistently liberal people, consistently conservative people, what their most trusted news outlets were, they said Fox News, Hannity, Limbaugh, and Glenn Beck. They trust them. They pay attention to them. It makes them feel good about themselves to listen to them. What are you going to tell them? You're wrong. You should change. You should let go of everything that gives you meaning and makes you happy because it's inconsistent with reality as I understand it. I don't know that there's a solution based on users, on readers and viewers. I think people are stuck in the system they're stuck, in the structure that they're stuck, and if you can identify levers where you can change the structure, then people might slowly start to climb down off the limb they're on. And in that regard, the most important people are the people who are not yet fully in the grip of the Fox News Breitbart universe, but are only 1 foot in. Those are the people who, in some sense, can still be brought back to something like reality. And that needs to be the initial focus in my view.
The book is Network Propaganda, Manipulation, Disinformation, and Radicalization in American Politics, authored by Yochai Benkler and co-authors Robert Farris, Hal Roberts. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Professor, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time today.
Thank you. It was lovely to spend time with you.